Hello and welcome to Nightlights. My name is Alex Walsh and I'm delighted to be hosting this new series outside the WORLDwrite studios here in East London. For our first programme we're tackling Hillsborough, and as the light fades we're hoping to shed some fresh light on that horrific event and what has happened ever since. In 1989, during an FA Cup semi-final between Liverpool and Nottingham Forest, 96 Liverpool fans were crushed to death at Hillsborough Stadium in Sheffield. 25 years on, and this tragedy is still in the news as fresh inquests are underway. In this special programme we will look at why a new inquest. Do we need one to really get to the truth? How are football fans treated today, and what has changed since Hillsborough? We have three exceptional guests with us today along with our volunteers to help us do just that. They are Mick Hume. Mick is editor-at-large for the online magazine Spiked and author of There Is No Such Thing as Free Press, and we need one now more than ever. Mick is also a columnist for Manchester United's fanzine Red Issue. We also have with us Kirk Leach. Kirk is the Executive Director of the European Animal Research Association. He is a trustee of WORLDwrite and a Newcastle United season ticket holder. And finally, last but not least, we have Steve Daly. Steve is a mobile communications consultant and newly interim assistant director at WORLDwrite. A warm welcome to our volunteers at WORLDwrite here. We have Avita, Marissa, Ikra and Katrina. So Mick, could you maybe start us off by giving a few thoughts?
I thought it was quite remarkable on the 25th anniversary of Hillsborough, which just happened in April, to hear everybody from the Tory Prime Minister David Cameron to the autocratic President of FIFA making speeches and sending out tweets expressing their sympathy and empathy with the victims' families from Hillsborough, and all agreeing what a terrible thing Hillsborough was. All of them talking as if Hillsborough had happened on another planet somewhere 25 years ago and was really nothing to do with them. It made you think that, God, Britain must have been a very different place 25 years ago. Was it? Maybe it was run by the Nazis or something, where they were talking about it, as a kind of alien race. And I think what struck me was, first of all, there's an attempt to absolve the British authorities from blame for Hillsborough. It's about nailing the sun for it. And what we should understand is the context in which Hillsborough took place was created by a Tory government and an entire British establishment and their kind of informal war on football fans. And the second thing that struck me about it was that they talk about it as if now everything has changed. Well, a lot of things have changed in the last 25 years, but what hasn't changed, I think we're going to talk about that tonight, is the underlying prejudice that football supporters are basically scum.
Obviously one's heart goes out to the people who died, who left their homes to go to a football match, and their families would have expected, the worst they could have expected was a defeat by Nottingham Forest. And I was at a game at the same time Newcastle United were playing Arsenal just around the corner, and in those days people had what were called transistor radios. Nobody had mobile phones, and somebody was saying there's some terrible news happening, so it took a while for it to come through, and obviously shock led to kind of anger actually at what had happened and the way that football fans are being kind of caged in that kind of situation. A lot of the discussion about Hillsborough has become a conspiracy theory that the police were hiding what they did on the day, and obviously the police, should be castigated for what they did, but this kind of obsession with there was a conspiracy kind of means that the reality, as Mick kind of said earlier, of the way the football fans were demonised has gone by, to the extent where something which happened quite recently, which was the anniversary of the Bradford fire, and I was living in Bradford at the time, where 56 people died in a fire. Because that doesn't come with a kind of conspiracy discussion, nobody talks about it. This was the people in a wooden stadium with rubbish underneath, football fans treated like they were kind of like animals. And 56 people died, it's barely mentioned, nobody tweeted about it. The Prime Minister certainly didn't say he was really sorry about it. And that's in stark comparison to Hillsborough. Hillsborough's mentioned now because it's all about we were lied to, and I think that's a problem actually.
I agree with that totally. I mean, I think one of the things that I remember really from watching the Hillsborough massacre unfold on the TV live was the sense that this was actually something that could have happened at any game, any FA Cup semi-final, any big match, any first division game at the time. I mean, because in some respects, any football fan would have recognised the attitude of the authorities and the manner in which the football fan, in the terrace was basically just treated as a public order problem. What actually happened at football matches in the 1980s and from the mid-70s onwards was actually almost like a different country, because actually the level of militarisation and the level of aggressive policing that took place is very different from what happens today. There was almost a kind of war footing at every football match you attended.
The erection of those metal gates, it's the stadium's problem, not the police. The police didn't push for those to be put up.
2 years before Hillsborough, I was down the road seeing Newcastle United playing Spurs on a Thursday night in an FA Cup semi-final, and thousands of Newcastle fans were pushed into the paddock in the middle, and either side of the paddock were kind of two empty kind of areas, and it was similar to Hillsborough actually, and fans were kind of clambering over the cages to get out, and they were arrested by the police. Other fans who got out were trying to open the gates, and a kind of like a fight started between the police and the stewards. And I remember looking around and seeing guys, a bit like you've seen at Hillsborough, were being pulled up. And that was the experience of fans. Whether the police argue for it or not is beside the point. I mean, they were a militarised force in those days against football fans. The Tory government at the time made football fans seem to be like public enemy number one at times.
But do you think some football fans gave that reputation off? You know, I watched a documentary the other day about football riots, football hooliganism in the 70s and 80s. You see some horrific stuff. You see there was about 11 stabbings a game.
Pretty much as long as there's been organised football in Britain, there's been violence in the crowd. There's been trouble in the crowd. You put a lot of young working class blokes together, they don't behave like as if they're at a dinner party in Islington. 100 years ago, you can read all these protest people talking about the problem of football crowds blaspheming and using blasphemous language and how they ought to be dealt with because of that. And in the 70s and 80s, you had the whole hooligan panic. Now we have a discussion about something different. But you know, that has always been the pretext for an overreaction. In the 70s and 80s, you had that kind of overreaction, which meant that being a football sport, particularly being an away fan, meant that you were treated as kind of a cross between a prisoner of war and an animal, really. Ken Bates, who was then the chairman of Chelsea, wanted to combine the treating of football fans like animals and prisoners of war by actually not only having cages but putting an electrified cattle fence around the pitch at Stamford Bridge. So certainly the football authorities were up to their necks, and it wasn't just the police. They had a militarised regime there, which, as Steve says, you know, anybody who watched that Hillsborough thing unfolding, and they switched to it on Grandstand on BBC TV that afternoon. You could actually see what was happening. Anybody who'd ever been to a football match knew exactly what was going on there, because, as Steve indicates, you know, every away match, every big away match was a Hillsborough waiting to happen. You know, when you were stuffed into those cages and treated as a public order problem. Before there was any public disorder, you were treated as a public order problem anyway. The whole thing about the minority of fans and all of that, we should be quite clear about this, that there's always been trouble at football. A lot of people have used to enjoy it, used to be part of the Saturday day out. It was never the threat to Western civilization that it was made out to be, but it became the pretext for basically militarising football as an experiment.
The parliamentary report in the late 1960s said that they were bringing in all sorts of weapons into the stadiums, and there was chanting obscene chants, and football fans were seen not as fellow citizens any longer, but as a problem that need to be dealt with.
I think it's useful to go back and look at that period, because if you look at some of the things that were kind of done to football fans in the name of law and order. If you went to a football game, you had to go on special trains, alcohol was banned, you get to the railway station, the police would march you to the ground. The whole CCTV thing came in, which today is accepted, but that time was done around kind of football hooligans. You had to take your passport into the police station, so in case you were going to go abroad. The media was complicit in this. A good example to compare then and now would be the Times. I know the Times in the 1980s wrote some terrible things about football fans, but compare the Times to the 25th anniversary of Hillsborough, it was like the war dead, whereas 25 years ago newspapers like the Times and others were complicit in creating this kind of hyper atmosphere which justified by introducing identity cards for a football fan. Something today which would be people be up in arms about, but then it was taken seriously. Maybe we do need to have identity cards. It's perfectly okay to take the passport off somebody because they can't travel because in case they go to a football match. So that atmosphere was created where pretty anti-democratic measures were taken as seemed to be sensible.
So people nowadays talk about going to football matches which are kind of sterile, where everyone's seated down and watching a match just go on. We're not supposed to chant certain things, we're not supposed to wave certain flags, and I don't think football fans go there about the chanting and the waving of flags. I think football fans don't really care about that. All they want to see is the football match as such. So I mean, I think that's why they're not protesting against the regulations.
I would disagree with that because I think people hold strong emotional ties to their football team, and I think because of that, they form an identity through their football teams. That's why they're so passionate about it.
In a way, these regulations actually make the environment safer.
But who wants safe football? Football is not about being safe. I mean, you said fans want to do is watch the game, but if you want to do that, you can just get Sky Sports and watch the game. If you go to the match, it's about something else. I mean, I say this as someone who's too old to do this anymore, but unfortunately, one of the reasons that there's very little atmosphere at Premier League games now is that the average Premier League fan is the same age as I am, because young people who used to go can't afford it anymore. But anyway, it's about atmosphere. It's about being part of something. It's the one thing that actually people feel any kind of emotional attachment to these days, which is why politicians who used to hate football fans are now so keen to be associated with football, because they think it's one way they can talk to a crowd. So when you remove that, you really remove part of football, and it is a very sterile environment, which is why a lot of people prefer watching it in the pub, because you can sing in the pub in a way and stand up in a way that you get attacked for doing it in the ground.
I'm a Newcastle United fan, and when we play Sunderland, who are kind of local competitors, I guess, and Newcastle fans take along printed passports and start waving passports at the Sunderland fans. That's because Sunderland never been in Europe, so basically the chant is, this is a passport, you don't need one, you've never been in Europe. So there's a high degree of irrationality about it. So I think, in a sense, you're taking it too seriously. And people can go there to watch the football, but I think in general they go there to be part of something collectively, to have a laugh, to bond with their mates, to swear, to say a few things that you probably couldn't say in the home, at school, at work. I think now the way that you're policed inside the football ground, there's a lot of emphasis now on sitting down, not swearing, not having a good time. I mean, I'm not a smoker, you can't even smoke any longer. I've seen people pulled out of grounds and lose their season tickets for smoking in the football ground. It's highly policed. So I think there is a bit of enjoyment of football, but I think it's more about just being part of something beyond yourself, actually.
So how would you suggest that we prevent violent attacks or any aggressive behaviour?
Well, for somebody, for my sins, who was involved in a bit of boxing, fisticuffs when I was a kid, I mean, I go to football matches a lot less than I used to, and I cannot remember the last time I saw a fight in a football ground. I would say the last 10 years, I've not seen a fight in a football ground. Sometimes these people who want to be involved in this can't go to the games, and they meet in Tesco's car park an hour before the game and have a bit of a fight. But even that is gone. I mean, if you look at the figures released by the police, arrests for football hooliganism as such have gone down. But when you look at the figures, the arrests of things like smoking in the ground, chanting, not sitting down when you're supposed to, the kind of micromanagement of football fans. You do not see fights anymore in football grounds, you do not.
But do you think that's happened because it's been micromanaged? Do you think incidences of violence have gone down because we've addressed it as a serious issue now, and because of micromanagement, this prevents any fights from happening?
The kind of like the excitement of a football fan left the game before this micromanagement took place. I think actually, if they try to introduce the stuff they do now, where you can't say certain things, can't do certain things, 20 years ago, there would have been a lot more response to it. I think that the passion has gone out of it as a spectator, so it's much easier for them to get away with doing things that they couldn't have done 20 odd years ago.
So you think all the policing that's been put into action now to protect football fans and the footballers and stuff, do you feel they've taken all the fun away and you can no longer express yourself in the way you wish to express yourself in case you get arrested for saying a word that's now not allowed to be said, basically?
You have to be careful about us old farts sitting here being nostalgic. Going to football now is a much more comfortable and in some ways kind of pleasant experience, which is why they talk about it, as it's great for families and all of that. Personally, as a family man, I don't want football to be a family sport. One of the things that's changed is that football used to be the place, and still is to an extent, but to a far less extent, where you could say things and behave there in a way that you would never do in normal life. It's like a 90-minute kind of pantomime for adults. Right? You could just kind of get your rocks off. I always talk about it as, in Freudian terms, it's kind of the home ground of the id, the emotional, irrational side of the brain. As Kirk says, that's very strong for football fans. Now what you have is not only that's gone, but you've actually got the reverse, where there are special rules for football fans which actually don't apply to the rest of society. Special measures for how you must behave in these circumstances. Kind of gross example of that is the Scottish law, new law, the Offensive Behaviour at Football Act, which specifically criminalises things that people do at football that wouldn't be a crime somewhere else. So if you're a Celtic fan, you can be arrested for singing a song or waving a flag that wouldn't be illegal outside a match. Even more ironically, if you're a Rangers fan, you could be arrested for singing God Save the Queen if the police decided that that was an offensive and provocative act. I don't know what will happen now if Scotland goes independent, how that will change.
So what are the key differences between the 80s and now?
I mean, we could be here all night. I mean, a lot has changed on and off the field. Fans are now seen as consumers, whereas, you know, in the 1980s, maybe they were seen as fans. But in the 1980s, in terms of this discussion, I think that it might seem a bit crude, but I think in general, football fans were seen as kind of wild dogs, which need to be kind of caged, and the metaphor of the caging suited that. And from going to the game to leaving the game, you were surrounded by the police, caged in the past, and now treated as kind of school children, need to be looked after.
Like they don't know any better.
Yeah.
I would also add to that, I think the contempt towards the football fans remains, because if we look back in 2009, there was some clashes between Millwall and West Ham and the police, which tragically led to one death. The way the fans were portrayed, not just by the elite, you know, by the whole media, as wild animals, as the Sun put it, is quite interesting and shows that that contempt is still there.
In the middle of the 80s, the Sunday Times, after the Heysel disaster and the Bradford fire, the Sunday Times referred to football, called football, a slum sport played in slum stadiums, watched largely by slum people who deter decent folk from attending. That was like the kind of establishment view what football was. And now, of course, the last 20 years, all those so-called decent folk have all fallen in love with football, and they love the beautiful game. And you get all these kind of the kind of Guardian set have attached themselves to it. They love the beautiful game, but they hate the ugly people who most of the crowd still are, and most of the players still are. But rather than just being called hooligans or whatever, as I say, you now get accused of being knuckle-dragging homophobes, as the Guardian refers to football supporters. So the language has changed, and also the people making the attacks have changed, but the underlying kind of contempt and revulsion, is fear and loathing, I think is probably the best expression, is still there.
So why an inquest now?
It's probably important for the families that they have a proper detailed account of what happened to their loved ones, which they've never really had, because the first inquest absolved anybody of responsibility for anything, more or less. So I can understand it from their point of view, but I think there is a problem with the having the inquest on various levels, particularly the way it's determining the wider discussion, because it focuses everything on what happened on the day. Who did what on the day? That's what the inquest is about, and that's what too much of the discussion has been about the last 25 years, and far too little has been about the context, which we've been talking about tonight, which made Hillsborough possible. You know, the fact that it was a time when Margaret Thatcher's government wanted to introduce identity cards, as Kirk says, only for football fans, treating away fans as prisoners of war, created a situation where Hillsborough could have happened at any big match. None of that is being talked about. The inquest is only about what happened on the day, and so leave that for the families to find out what happened to their loved ones. The wider discussion ought to be about something else, ought to be about the political and cultural situation which enabled that to happen. Now, you talk about can we find out the truth? This is the bizarre thing about it, because all these revelations have come out over the last few years, and we've been told time and time again, now finally we can learn the truth about Hillsborough. Well, you know, it may come as a shock to some of these people to realise that many of us knew the truth about Hillsborough the day it happened. There wasn't any great mystery about what had created that situation. Infamously, people remember the Sun front page, the truth, which said Liverpool fans had urinated on the dead, robbed the dead, attacked policemen who were trying to save them. A couple of days after that, at the time I was the editor of this paper, The Next Step, which is the paper of the Revolutionary Communist Party, both sadly deceased long ago. We published this front page, Hillsborough, the Truth, which was a response to that discussion. Thatcher led the law and order drive which caged fans. Police treated dying fans as a public order problem. Press liars abused the dead to cover up the truth, and went on in a similar vein. That's about 3 days after Hillsborough. So For anybody that knew situational football, there wasn't any great mystery. Remembering of Hillsborough now is only half remembering it. It's only remembering part of it. It's not remembering the bigger issue. And that bigger issue matters not only because of getting the historical record straight, but because of what we're talking about, the fact that there is still those kind of prejudices still inform the way in which football crowds are treated as a public order problem.
You know, if you were the son, the daughter, the mother or father of somebody who died, you want to know the truth. But you know, if you look at if you take what happened at Hillsborough slightly outside of football, and look at what's happening in broader society, where there was, you know, people involved in trade union struggles or struggles around anti-racism or people involved in politics. When we look at what the police did on the day at Hillsborough and afterwards, was completely normal for the police in those days to massage the story. So if I was a family, I can understand why they're doing it. But in reality, that was what the police were like in those days. But there are a whole number of kind of campaigns down the road. The Tottenham Three were 3 people who the police are still trying to find who was involved in the killing of a policeman during the riot on Bradford Farm. But there were 3 people basically, essentially, fitted up by the police and sent down. There are people involved in the struggle at that time for Irish freedom. The Birmingham Six, they were called, the Guildford Four. It's shocking what happened to the story about Hillsborough, but in a sense, that's what the police were like in those days.
Why now? Why is there another inquest? Why the politicians are no longer able to cover all these things up?
I think that's partly because of the media. I think everything due to the internet, and because now we are living in a media saturated society, everything is much more transparent.
I actually think it's a bit more than that. I mean, I think there are many different reasons why now. And clearly the families were lied to. If you look at the inquest discovered there were 164 kind of interviews the police did. 116 took out evidence about what the police had done that day. So clearly they were lied to. But because of that, and because the we live in a society where people always think there's something to be hidden, there's a conspiracy, we're being lied to. Hillsborough gives itself to that. So look at the response to Hillsborough compared to, as we discussed before, the Bradford fire, where 56 people died in a terrible tragedy. It's barely mentioned.
Not only is it the fact that people see conspiracies everywhere, but that those who are supposed to be behind these conspiracies actually can't cover up anything anymore. You know, that the establishment's become such a porous thing that the bloke who runs the Premier League can't even have a sexist joke with his mates on his personal emails without being hauled over the coals for it. I think you've got a political class now which can't hold the line anymore, which is constantly wants to disassociate itself and distance itself from its own past. So even the Tories don't want to be associated with what the Thatcherites did in the 1980s too closely. It may appear to be sympathetic on their part. It's actually a sign of real kind of weakness and spinelessness on their part in another sense. There's also something else that's very important which has changed in British society in the last 25 years, which is the dominance now of victim culture. That the way that you get moral authority in any situation is by putting yourself in the position of the victim. Now, the Hillsborough families are genuine victims. They're not, you know, pretend victims or media victims or celebrity victims. But they have been incorporated into this kind of post-Diana victim culture where everyone wants to be on their side, everyone wants to be associated with them. To speak against them or to criticise anything that they say, it's almost sacrilegious. So that, for example, every time the proposal for reintroducing standing in British football matches comes up, someone only has to say, but the Hillsborough families are against it, and that's pretty much the end of the discussion, or it has been until now anyway. So I think that is also a very important part of why the politicians and the political class and the media class want to be on the side of the Hillsborough families and the Hillsborough victims these days. We shouldn't see that. I mean, I'm an old cynic, but we shouldn't see that, I think, as an entirely kind of sympathetic move. It's to do with a change in political culture and not entirely positive either.
Sorry, how it would make the politicians look.
Yes.
Them supporting the families now.
Exactly.
To better themselves.
When the Labour Culture Secretary turned up at Anfield about 5 years ago for a Hillsborough event and was booed, he now says, I would have booed me. I quite agree with them booing me. You know, and that's anything to be kind of in that camp, you know.
I have a question about how they have bubble matches and how they have segregation of fans over here, because where I come from India, and over there we hardly ever have separate stands for fans from the two teams. So I'm finding it a little strange and different, really.
Well, not as strange as people who kind of experience it. I remember going from Newcastle to Sunderland to see Newcastle play, and To get a ticket for the game, you have to turn up about 5 hours beforehand, go on a bus with helicopters above you, taken on coaches to the game. And the guy I was sat next to was what Newcastle fans call a sand dancer, which is somebody from South Shields, who's basically where the sand is. And he was a Newcastle United fan, but he lives in South Shields, close to Sunderland. He had to spend 2 hours coming from South Shields to Newcastle to get a ticket, which was given out by the police and by the bus, to sit on the bus, then travel. The game started 5 hours beforehand to the game, watch Newcastle win, thankfully, get back on the bus, go back to Newcastle, and then spend another 2 hours getting back to Sunderland a different way. And that is the police. I mean, that's the police have allowed that. It is a restriction on people's rights to go to games, and it's indicative that it happens and nobody really says anything. The football fans themselves are angry about it. If you have to travel 7 hours for a game, which you could, he lived half an hour from the game. But it's the kind of thing that's accepted now because it's on the back of the idea that football hooligans need to be controlled.
I also think it's a self-fulfilling prophecy that when you're expected to behave badly, then you will behave badly.
Very much.
So
You're saying someone's expected to behave badly, then they will. You know, what are the police supposed to do if they do start behaving badly?
Well, one of the ironies actually of these days is the police don't want to intervene. I went to see Newcastle play Sunderland last year, and Sunderland won, and Sunderland fans jumped on the pitch. The stewards basically pushed them back in, and afterwards my friend was talking to the policeman about why the police don't jump on the pitch and get these football fans, and he was told that the line from the police is, what Sky TV don't want to see is a policeman chasing a football fan across a pitch like used to happen in the past. They leave it to the stewards. And basically they film what takes place, then afterwards they knock on doors and arrest people. And the policeman said they were told for health and safety reasons they're not told to intervene, so basically it's safer if the police stand back, film what takes place, go back and look at the film and arrest people.
Yeah, as always, the policing of football relates to the general attitude of policing. That's I mean, if you think about the way police deal with demonstrations these days, the kettling idea, which is basically just hold them all in one place, don't intervene, and wait till they get so bored and desperate for a pee that we can kind of let their mums come and collect them and take them home. These student demonstrations and so on, or they want water cannons. Now, a water cannon is not a, you know, like a riot baton. It's not a it's a go away and leave me alone weapon, basically. And that's the kind of police attitude. So they do two things in relation to football. One is they try and prevent anybody doing anything wrong through the kind of measures that you're talking about, the bubble match stuff. And there's a section of basically every piece of legislation that's brought in to deal with violent teenagers on the street is used for football fans. So they have a piece of legislation now which they use to basically ban whole coachloads of football fans on a match day, not only from the stadium or from a particular pub, but from a whole town. They say, right, we're issuing you with this order and you can't come into this town for the remainder of today. That's their preventative policing. And secondly, video everything, put the pictures in the local paper, pursue them over the next 6 months. Very cowardly kind of policing, but very effective in terms of, you know, dealing with the nailing football fans. Just one other point in relation to what you were talking about the different cultures and what should the police do. It's very interesting because, you know, this is not the way football fans are treated everywhere in the world by any stretch of the imagination. I remember very interestingly, right at the end of the 80s, going to a football match in Naples, in Italy. Me and my wife went, which was a bit of an experience for her, and we ended up in the Curva Sud, which is the hooligan end, the curve. And you went into the Naples stadium, and basically, outside of the terrace, ringed around the pitch were riot police, facing the fans, right, with all the gear, making the point that if anybody comes out of there, we are going to shoot you. Inside the terrace, there's no police or stewards at all. It's completely run by the ultras, by the fans' own organisations, and it's absolute maelstrom going on in there. You know, people can do whatever they want in there, and it was great. It was great. It was very. If you wanted to take your family, it wasn't the place to go. But if you wanted a really great kind of young people's Saturday afternoon out with no rules, it was a fantastic experience. So, you know, there are different cultural norms for policing. Unfortunately, I think even in Italy these things are now spreading, and the attempt to kind of police language at football is becoming a big thing.
One of the kind of current obsessions is racism of football. One of the real ironies of the campaign against racism of football is that when racism was a real problem at football, nobody was interested in doing anything about it. I remember going to football games and seeing people selling National Front news outside football grounds. outside the Newcastle United ground. I remember walking past there with my dad, and I kind of spat in this guy's face, and my dad chinned this National Front seller. I mean, it was a time when there was racism at football grounds. One of the real ironies today is that when there's absolutely virtually no racism from football fans at all, everybody's obsessed with talking about it.
The striking irony is that the less overt racism and prejudice there is expressed at football, the more campaigns and official campaigns, government-backed, FA-backed campaigns against it there are. And that speaks to a very important development in football in the last 20, 25 years, which is you not only have to deal with the police now at football, but most importantly you have to deal with the thought police. Football has become the arena in which the new kind of policing of language has reached its most absurd lengths, where you've got Liverpool have issued their stewards with lists of words which cannot be said at Anfield and they've got to deal with, which include not only the obvious, you know, the N-word, the P-word and all those kind of things, but also include man up, you're playing like a girl, anything like that. There's now, these have got to be prescribed, you know, they're kind of evil words that can't be spoken. So the thought police at football is a very important development, and that's, you know, my column that I write in Red Issue that you talked about is actually, that's what it's about, it's free speech for football. I think the big difference between the time of Hillsborough and now, an additional big difference, is that in those days there was a general feeling that if all football fans were crushed to death on terraces, it wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing. I went to a comedy show in London where a woman who's now a national treasure, was then considered an alternative comedian, made a joke, post-Heysel joke about the fact that the ban was going to be lifted and English fans were going to be allowed back into Europe. She said, I don't want them to go back into Europe, I want them all to stay in this country and kill each other. And that was that, you know, and everyone, ha ha ha, big laugh. But that was basically, there was some truth in that as a prejudice about football fans. Now, the authorities, the establishment, they don't want to kill all football fans. They want them to go to football, create a bit of noise where they can have an atmosphere, but do it in a very polite, controlled, considered way. As Kirk said, be well-behaved children. You know, no smoking at the back of the bus. As a final message in relation to all this, I think one of the most atrocious things that's happened recently is the arrest of Tottenham Hotspur fans for calling themselves Yiddos. That's supposed to be offensive and racist language. And I think that there's a message we want to send out to football fans and to the authorities today. It should be the chant that comes from the Tottenham terraces, we'll sing what we like. And that's the spirit that all football fans ought to take up if we're going to get our game back.
Well, I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. Thank you very much to our special guests, Mick Hume, Kirk Leach and Steve Daly, and to all of our WORLDwrites volunteers. If you'd like to get involved in a WORLDwrite shoot in the future, then please do email us. Thank you for watching.